The silence in Juliette Vance's brownstone had weight. It pressed against her temples as she sat in her pristine living room, staring at her phone screen. 17 missed calls from her mother, 43 unread text messages. The latest headline from Page 6 glowed mockingly. Political princess Juliette Vance left high and dry as fiancé Sebastian Price announces engagement to senator's daughter. She set the phone face down on the marble coffee table. Her reflection stared back from its polished surface, distorted and hollow. The woman looking back wore a cream cashmere sweater that cost more than most people's rent. But her eyes held the emptiness of someone who had been performing for so long she had forgotten what was real. The doorbell rang. Juliette's heart jumped, then settled into resignation. She had made this appointment herself, though now it felt like watching someone else's bad decision unfold in slow motion. Her heels clicked against the hardwood as she walked to the front door, each step echoing in the cavernous space. Through the peephole, she saw him. Isaiah Cole stood on her doorstep with his hands in his coat pockets, his breath visible in the December air. He was taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders that filled out his wool peacoat. His face was calm, unreadable, the face of someone who had learned to mask his thoughts long ago. She opened the door, and cold air rushed past him into her warm sanctuary. "Ms. Vance." His voice was deeper than it had sounded over the phone, with a hint of gravel that suggested cigarettes or late nights or both. "Juliette, please." She stepped aside to let him in, noting how he paused at the threshold, taking in the opulent entryway with its crystal chandelier and original oil paintings. His dark eyes moved from the artwork to her face, and she felt suddenly exposed, as if he could see through the carefully applied makeup to the exhaustion beneath. "Nice place," he said, but there was no envy in his tone, just observation. She led him to the living room, gesturing to the ivory leather sofa. He sat with careful precision, as if he understood that everything in this room cost more than he made in a month. The space between them felt charged with unspoken questions. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Water?" She was stalling, and they both knew it. "I'm fine." He studied her with those dark eyes. "Why don't you tell me what this is really about?" Juliette sat across from him, crossing her legs at the ankle in the way her mother had taught her. Proper posture. Always proper posture. "I told you on the phone. I need someone to accompany me to some social events." "As my boyfriend?" Hung. He leaned back slightly. "And why exactly do you need to hire a boyfriend?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Juliette felt her cheeks warm, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm sure you've seen the news." "I don't really follow society pages." Of course he didn't. She looked down at her hands, perfectly manicured nails folded in her lap. "My fiancé left me for someone else. Rather publicly. I have several events this weekend that I can't cancel, and I refuse to show up looking like some pathetic woman who can't keep a man. So you're hiring one instead." The bluntness of his words made her flinch. "It's a business arrangement. You'll be compensated well for your time." Isaiah was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Juliette could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, marking time with mechanical precision. She wondered what he was thinking. This man who had answered her desperate Craigslist ad with nothing more than a phone number, and the assurance that he was presentable and articulate. "How well?" he asked finally. $5,000. For the weekend, his eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a lot of money for pretending." "It's a lot of pretending." He stood up then, walking to the window that overlooked the tree-lined street. His reflection in the glass was darker than hers, solid, where she was translucent. "What makes you think I can pull this off? Acting like I belong in your world?" The question caught her off guard. She had been so focused on her own desperation that she hadn't considered his perspective. "You sounded educated on the phone." "Professional, educated." He turned back to her, and there was something sharp in his expression now. "Right? I didn't mean." "What did you mean?" She felt heat rise in her cheeks. This was not going the way she had planned. In her mind, this had been simple. She would offer money. He would accept. They would attend the events. And she would salvage what was left of her reputation. She hadn't anticipated this quiet intensity, the way he seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed facade. "I meant that you speak well, that you'll be able to fit in, Fit in. He repeated the words slowly, tasting them. With your friends, your family, your world? Yes. He moved back to the sofa, but didn't sit. Instead, he stood looking down at her. And for the first time in weeks, Juliette felt small in her own home. Let me get this straight, he said. You want me to show up to your fancy parties, smile pretty, hold your hand, and make everyone believe that the poor little rich girl isn't alone after all? That's not how I would put it. How would you put it? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Because when he said it like that, it sounded exactly as pathetic as it was. She was buying herself a boyfriend, like other people bought expensive handbags, not because she needed one, but because she couldn't stand the thought of being seen without one. Please, she said, and the word came out smaller than she intended. I'll double it. 10,000. He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not greed, but something else. Something that looked almost like pity. I don't want your money, he said quietly. Her heart sank. Then why are you here? Because, he said, sitting down again, this time closer to her. Nobody should have to be that alone. Hey, stop racism, extra fam. So happy you're here today. Before we get all dramatic with the story, let's take a quick roll call. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country and state in the comments below. And hey, be honest, what did you think of the story so far? We read every single comment. Yes, even the long ones. And your words truly keep us going. Let's try something fun, Con. We hit 50 comments on this video. We think you can do it. Your support isn't just appreciated, it's the heartbeat of what we do. So don't forget to show some love, comment, share, and let's keep the good vibes rolling together. You're awesome. Juliette felt something crack inside her chest at his words, but she quickly sealed it back up with practiced efficiency. Vulnerability was not part of her vocabulary. Not anymore. She straightened her shoulders and slipped back into the role. She knew best. The woman in control. So you'll do it? She asked, her voice steady again. Isaiah nodded slowly. 2 days. That's it. And I want to know exactly what I'm walking into. She reached for the leather portfolio she had prepared. Flipping. It opened to reveal a detailed itinerary printed on heavy cardstock. Everything was organized with military precision, from arrival times to wardrobe suggestions. Tomorrow evening is the Whitmore Foundation charity auction. It's black tie, about 200 guests. Old money, political connections, the usual crowd. She slid the paper across the coffee table to him. Saturday afternoon is brunch at the Metropolitan Club with my mother and her circle. Very traditional, very, very white, he finished. She felt her cheeks flush again. The guest list is ... homogeneous. Yes, but that's not. I mean, it's not about that, isn't it? He was reading the itinerary, his finger tracing down the list of events. Saturday night is dinner at Senator Morrison's house. Sunday is the gallery opening in Soho. Tell me, Juliette, how many black faces do you think I'll see at these events? The way he said her name made her stomach tighten, not with attraction exactly, but with something more complicated. Recognition, maybe. The way he looked at her made her feel like he could see all the carefully hidden cracks in her armor. Some, she said, defensively. These are progressive, circles, diverse, progressive. He set the paper down and leaned back, studying her. Right, the kind of diverse where you hire the diversity. That's not what this is. What is it then? She fumbled for words, her usual eloquence abandoning her. How could she explain that this wasn't about his race? It was about her fear, that she would rather pay a stranger to pretend to love her than face the pitying looks and whispered conversations. Alone. It's about saving face, she said finally. My reputation, my family's standing in the community. Your ego. The word hit like a slap. Excuse me? Your ego, he repeated calmly. You can't stand the thought of people thinking you weren't good enough to keep your fiancé. So you're buying yourself a replacement. I am not buying. What would you call it? She stood up abruptly, pacing to the fireplace where family photos lined the mantel. Pictures of her and Sebastian at various charity events, posed smiles that now looked grotesque in hindsight. Her mother at Cotillion, her father before the heart attack, all of them performing their roles perfectly. "I'm hiring someone to help me through a difficult time," she said to the photographs. "Help you lie through a difficult time." She spun around to face him. "We all lie, Mr. Cole. Every day. You think the smiles in those pictures are real? You think anyone at those parties is being genuine? At least I'm being honest about the performance. Are you?" He stood too, and she realized how much taller he was than her, even in her heels. But he didn't use his height to intimidate. Instead, he seemed to fold himself smaller, less threatening. "Because it seems to me like you're lying to yourself most of all. You don't know me?" "No, I don't. But I know that look." He gestured toward her face. "I've seen it in the mirror plenty of times. That's the look of someone who's been pretending for so long they don't remember what the truth feels like." The grandfather clock chimed a half hour, its deep notes resonating through the silence that stretched between them. Juliette could feel her heart beating against her ribs like a trapped bird. "What kind of actor are you?" she asked, desperate to change the subject. "The unemployed kind, mostly." His mouth quirked up in what might have been a smile. "I do some work at a small theater in Harlem. Shakespeare, mostly. Some contemporary pieces. I wait tables to pay rent." Shakespeare. She latched on to this. Something safer than the conversation they had been having. "Which plays?" "Othello. Recently, anyway." He watched her face as he said it, looking for a reaction. She didn't give him one. That must be ... challenging, in more ways than one. Sat back down, and the tension in the room shifted slightly. "Your turn. What do you do when you're not hiring boyfriends?" "I run fundraising campaigns for political candidates. Event planning, public relations." She remained standing by the fireplace, using the distance as armor. "I help people manage their image." Ironic. Why? Because you can't seem to manage your own. The observation stung because it was true. She, who had built a career on crafting other people's public personas, had spectacularly failed to protect her own when it mattered most. "I can play the part," she said quietly. "I just need someone else to play theirs." Isaiah nodded slowly. "All right, I'll be your boyfriend for the weekend, but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, no touching unless absolutely necessary. And if it's necessary, you ask first." "Agreed." "Second, if anyone asks how we met, we tell them the truth, that we met through mutual friends. We don't have mutual friends. We do now. Terry Washington. He's a friend of mine who knows your world. If anyone digs, the story holds up." She nodded, impressed despite herself at his foresight. "Third," he continued, "when this is over, it's over. No calls, no texts, no keeping in touch. Clean break, of course. And fourth," he paused, his dark eyes meeting hers. "No matter how good we are at this, don't forget, it's not real." The warning felt like it carried more weight than the others, though she couldn't understand why. She had no intention of forgetting this was performance. That was the whole point.
"Understood,"
she said. He stood and extended his hand. "Then, we have a deal." She crossed the room and shook it, her small white hand disappearing into his larger, darker one. His palm was warm and slightly rough, the hand of someone who worked with it. "I'll pick you up tomorrow at 7, she said. "I'll be ready." He headed toward the door, then paused. "Juliette." "Yes." "Try to remember, I'm not your enemy. I'm just the man you hired to help you pretend you're not alone." After he left, she stood in her empty living room listening to the silence. But somehow, it felt different now. Less oppressive. As if his presence had shifted something in the air, left behind the faintest trace of possibility. The Whitmore Foundation auction was held at the Natural History Museum, and as Juliette's town car pulled up to the red carpet entrance, she could see the photographers already positioned behind velvet ropes. The December evening was sharp with cold, and the lights from the camera flashes created a constellation of artificial stars against the dark sky. Isaiah sat beside her in the leather seat, wearing a tuxedo that fit him perfectly. She had been worried about that detail, but when he had emerged from his apartment building in Harlem, he looked like he had been born to wear formal wear. The black fabric of his jacket stretched across his broad shoulders without pulling, and his bow tie was perfectly straight. "You look nervous," he observed, his voice low enough that the driver couldn't hear. "I'm not nervous." But her hands were. clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white against the black silk of her evening gown. She had chosen the dress carefully elegant, but not attention-seeking, expensive, but not ostentatious. Everything calculated to send the right message, that she was fine, that she was thriving, that she didn't need Sebastian Price or anyone else. Right. Isaiah's tone was dry. Because you've only checked your lipstick 4 times since we left your house. She caught sight of herself in the window's reflection and realized he was right. Her red lipstick was perfect. Her upswept hair hadn't moved despite the car's movement. She looked flawless and felt hollow. The car stopped and she could hear the muffled sounds of the crowd outside. Laughter, conversation, the click of high heels on marble steps. Her world, the one she had navigated effortlessly for decades, suddenly felt foreign and threatening. "Showtime," Isaiah said softly. The driver opened her door and camera flashes immediately began popping. She stepped out with practiced grace, her movements fluid despite the churning in her stomach. This was what she did, performed under pressure, smiled when she wanted to hide, radiated confidence when she felt anything but. Isaiah appeared at her side, offering his arm. She took it, feeling the solid warmth of him through his jacket. His presence was steadying in a way she hadn't expected. "Juliette," a photographer called out, and she turned toward the voice with her public smile in place. Isaiah moved with her seamlessly, as if they had done this 100 times before. "Who's the handsome stranger?" Another photographer shouted. "Just a friend," she called back, but Isaiah leaned down and whispered something in her ear that made her laugh. It was genuine laughter, surprised out of her by whatever he had said, and the cameras captured it hungrily. "What did you say?" she asked, as they moved up the museum steps. "I told you that you have lipstick on your teeth. I do not." She touched her tongue to her teeth self-consciously. "No? But you laughed." Inside the museum, the party was in full swing. The main hall had been transformed into an elegant auction space, with round tables draped in white linen and centerpieces of white orchids. A string quartet played softly in one corner, while waiters in white jackets circulated with champagne and canapes. Juliette knew these people, had grown up with. Many of them had attended their weddings and charity galas and anniversary parties. But walking in with Isaiah, she felt like she was seeing them for the first time. The way conversations paused when they passed, the carefully neutral expressions, the polite smiles that didn't reach anyone's eyes. "Juliette, darling." Lucinda Park approached them with arms outstretched. She was wearing a silver gown that probably cost more than most people's cars, and her smile was bright and sharp as a blade. "You look absolutely radiant." Lucinda, "Hello." Juliette allowed herself to be air-kissed on both cheeks. "I'd like you to meet Isaiah Cole." "Isaiah, this is Lucinda Park." "Pleasure to meet you," Isaiah said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, his smile warm but professional. "Likewise." Lucinda's eyes moved over him assessingly. "And how do you to know each other?" "Through mutual friends," Juliette said quickly, just as they had practiced. "How lovely." But Lucinda's tone suggested she didn't find it lovely at all. "And what do you do, Isaiah?" "I'm in theater," he replied smoothly. "Currently working on a production of Macbeth." "How interesting." "Community theater. Off-Broadway." The slight correction was delivered without emphasis, but Juliette caught the flash of something in Isaiah's eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or resignation. "Well, that's wonderful," Lucinda said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. "Theater is so artistic." "It can be," Isaiah agreed. An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter from other conversations. Juliette could feel Lucinda's curiosity radiating from her like heat from a fire. "We should find our table," Juliette said finally. "Of course." Lucinda smiled her sharp smile. "Enjoy the evening." As they walked away, Isaiah leaned down to whisper in her ear again. "Friendly crowd." "She's always been protective of me," Juliette said. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't protection she had seen in Lucinda's eyes. It was speculation. They found their assigned table near the front of the room. Juliette had specifically requested good seats, another part of the performance, showing that her social standing hadn't diminished despite Sebastian's betrayal. The other guests at their table were familiar faces from the charity circuit. people she had worked with on various fundraising campaigns over the years. As they sat down, Isaiah's hand briefly touched the small of her back, guiding her into her chair. It was a small gesture, the kind of thing couples did automatically, but it sent an unexpected jolt through her. Not attraction, exactly, but awareness of his size, his warmth, his presence beside her. "You're good at this," she murmured as he took his seat. "At what?" "Playing the part." He looked at her steadily. "Who says I'm playing?" Before she could respond, the auction began, and she was forced to turn her attention to the stage where the auctioneer was describing the first lot. But Isaiah's words echoed in her mind, and she found herself stealing glances at him throughout the evening. He was charming without being obsequious, engaging in conversations about art and politics with the same ease he had shown with Lucinda. When Mrs. Whitmore herself stopped by their table, he listened attentively to her stories about the foundation's work and asked thoughtful questions that made the elderly woman beam with pleasure. But Juliette noticed other things too. The way his jaw tightened when someone made an offhand comment about urban youth programs. The careful neutrality of his expression when the man across from them launched into a monologue about welfare reform. The subtle way he deflected when someone asked where he lived. During the live auction portion of the evening, she bid on and won a week at a vineyard in Napa Valley. $25,000 for 7 days of wine tasting and spa treatments. It was excessive, but it sent the right message that she had money to burn, that Sebastian's departure hadn't affected her lifestyle. "Planning a trip?" Isaiah asked, quietly as the applause died down. "I might donate it back to be re-auctioned," she admitted. "It's really about the gesture of spending $25,000 you don't need on a vacation you won't take. The gesture of showing I can." He nodded slowly, but she caught something in his expression that looked like disapproval, or maybe disappointment. After the auction ended, they mingled for another hour. Juliette worked the room like the professional. She was moving from group to group, making sure she was seen with Isaiah, making sure people noticed how happy she looked. And she did look happy, the photographer from Town and Country told her so, complimenting her glow as he snapped pictures of her and Isaiah by the dinosaur exhibit. But by the time they left the museum, she was exhausted. The performance had drained her in a way she hadn't expected. In the car ride home, they sat in silence for several blocks. Finally, Isaiah spoke. "You don't have to touch me so much." She turned to look at him. "What?" The hand-holding, the arm around my waist, leaning into me when people were taking pictures. "You don't have to do all that," I thought. I thought it looked more convincing. It looked desperate. The word hit her like a physical blow. "Excuse me." Like you were trying too hard to prove something. People could see it. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment and anger. "I was trying to make it believable. It would be more believable if it felt natural. If it felt like you actually wanted to touch me, instead of like you were forcing yourself to for the cameras. I'm sorry if my performance wasn't up to your standards. This isn't about my standards." His voice was calm, which somehow made it worse. "It's about yours. You're so worried about what everyone else thinks that you've forgotten how to just ... be." The car pulled up in front of her brownstone, and she was out of it before the driver could come around to open her door. Isaiah followed her up the steps to her front door, but she turned to face him before he could speak. "Thank you for tonight," she said formally. "I'll pick you up at noon tomorrow for brunch." "Juliette, good night, Isaiah." She went inside and closed the door behind her, leaning against it as she listened to his footsteps retreat down the stone steps. In the mirror by the door, she could see herself: perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect dress. Everything in its place, except for the woman wearing it all. The Metropolitan Club occupied a corner of Fifth Avenue, like a fortress of old money and older traditions. Its limestone facade had weathered more than a century of New York seasons, and its windows looked out over Central Park with the kind of view that money couldn't buy, only inherit. Juliette sat in the back of another town car, checking her phone for the third time in 5 minutes. No messages from her mother, which could mean anything from approval to absolute fury. With Evelyn Vance, silence was often more dangerous than words. Isaiah looked different in daylight. Less mysterious, more real. He wore a navy blazer over dark slacks, A crisp white shirt, open at the collar. Conservative enough for her mother's crowd, but casual enough to suggest he didn't need to try too hard. She wondered if the choice was calculated or instinctive. "Nervous?" he asked, echoing his question from the night before. "My mother doesn't approve of surprises," she said, which was both true and a vast understatement. Evelyn Vance treated deviation from expectation like a personal affront to the natural order of things. "What did you tell her about me?" "That I was bringing someone." She smoothed her skirt, a simple black wool that struck exactly the right note between respectful and fashionable. She had done her research by now. Your full name, your address, your credit score, possibly your kindergarten attendance record. Isaiah's eyebrows rose. "Seriously? You'd be surprised what a determined society matron can discover before brunch." The car stopped, and Juliette could see her mother through the club's tall windows. Evelyn Vance sat at a round table in the main dining room, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her pearls catching the winter light. She was holding court with, for other women, all of them cut from the same expensive cloth, wives and widows of men who had shaped the city's financial and political landscape. "Remember," Juliette said as they walked up the club's marble steps, "she's going to test you. Not obviously, but she will. Just be yourself. Which self would you prefer?" Isaiah's tone was light, but there was an edge to it. Before she could answer, they were inside, and her mother was rising from her chair with the kind of smile that could freeze champagne. "Darling." Evelyn kissed her daughter's cheek, her lips barely making contact. "You look thin." "Mother, I'd like you to meet Isaiah Cole." "Isaiah, this is my mother, Evelyn Vance." Isaiah extended his hand with a warm smile. "Mrs. Vance, it's a pleasure to meet you." Evelyn took his hand briefly, her own pale and soft against his darker, stronger one. "Mr. Cole, how ... Unexpected." The word hung in the air like smoke. Juliette felt her shoulders tighten, but Isaiah seemed unruffled. "In a good way, I hope," he said. "Of course." Evelyn's smile never wavered. "Please, join us. I've taken the liberty of ordering champagne." She led them to the table where the other women waited with expressions of barely concealed curiosity. Introductions were made. Mrs. Rothschild, whose husband owned half of Manhattan's real estate. Mrs. Chen, who had married into shipping money. Mrs. Davidson, whose family name was on the wing of the Metropolitan Museum. And Mrs. Whitmore, who had thrown the previous evening's auction. "We were just discussing the wonderful turnout last night," Mrs. Whitmore said as they settled into their chairs. "Juliette, dear, you raised more money than we've seen in years." "The cause makes it easy," Juliette replied, accepting a glass of champagne from the waiter. "Everyone wants to help disadvantaged youth." "Speaking of which," Evelyn said, her voice deceptively casual, "Isaiah, where did you say you were from?" "I didn't," Isaiah replied with a slight smile, "but I grew up in Brooklyn." Bed-Stuy, the name of the neighborhood, settled over the table like dust. Brooklyn was acceptable if it was Brooklyn Heights or Park Slope. Bed-Stuy was something else entirely. "How interesting," Mrs. Chen murmured. "And your family?" "My mother was a teacher. My father worked for the city sanitation department." Juliette watched the women absorb this information, saw the subtle ways their expressions shifted. Not disapproval. Exactly, that would be too obvious. But a kind of careful neutrality that was somehow worse. "Public service," Mrs. Davidson said brightly. "How admirable." "They were good people," Isaiah said simply. "Were?" Evelyn's voice sharpened slightly. "They passed away a few years ago. Car accident." A moment of genuine sympathy crossed the women's faces, but it was quickly replaced by their habitual polite distance. Tragedy was acceptable, even noble, as long as it remained at arm's length. "I'm so sorry," Juliette said, and meant it. She realized she knew almost nothing about Isaiah's life, his history, the experiences that had shaped him. "Thank you." The waiter appeared to take their orders, and the conversation shifted to safer ground: upcoming charity events, mutual acquaintances, the weather. But Juliette could feel the undercurrent of tension, the way the women continued to assess Isaiah with every word he spoke. He handled it beautifully. When Mrs. Rothschild asked about his education, he mentioned Columbia without pretension. When Mrs. Chen inquired about his work, he spoke about theater with passion, but not defensiveness. He complimented Mrs. Davidson on her foundation's work with literacy programs, and asked, thoughtful questions about Mrs. Whitmore's upcoming gala. But Juliette saw what they were doing, the careful probing, the subtle tests. The way they smiled when he mentioned growing up in Bed-Stuy, but nodded approvingly when he talked about Colombia. The way they relaxed when he demonstrated knowledge of wine, but tensed when he mentioned taking the subway. "And how did you two meet?" Evelyn asked. During a lull in the conversation, "Through mutual friends," Juliette said quickly. "Which friends?" Juliette felt her heart skip. She and Isaiah had prepared for this question, but somehow her mother's direct gaze made her mind go blank. "Terry Washington," Isaiah said smoothly. "We went to school together. He knows Juliette through her work with the Democratic Party." "Terry Washington," Evelyn repeated. "The name sounds familiar. He's a campaign manager," Juliette said, grateful that Isaiah had done his homework. Terry was real, and his connections to both their worlds were plausible. "Ah, yes. Worked on Senator Morrison's last campaign, didn't he?" Mrs. Davidson asked. "That's right," Isaiah confirmed. The conversation moved on, but Juliette caught her mother watching her with sharp eyes. Evelyn Vance had not built her reputation by accepting easy answers, and something in her expression suggested she found their story too convenient. When the main course arrived, delicate portions of salmon and asparagus that looked more like art than food, Mrs. Chen launched into a story about her recent trip to the Hamptons. But Juliette barely heard it. She was too aware of Isaiah beside her, the way he held his fork, the way he listened attentively to conversations that must have bored him senseless. "You're very quiet today, darling," her mother observed. "Just tired. Last night was wonderful, but exhausting." "Yes, I heard you bid on the Napa trip. $25,000 is quite generous." There was something in her tone that made Juliette's cheeks warm. "It's for a good cause." "Of course it is." Evelyn's smile was sharp as cut. "Crystal, though I do hope you're being prudent with your spending these days." The implication was clear. Now that Sebastian was gone, Juliette's financial situation might be less secure. Never mind that she had her own career, her own income. In her mother's world, a woman's stability was always tied to her man. "I'm quite comfortable, thank you," Juliette said stiffly. "I'm sure you are. Still, it's wise to be careful, especially when one is adjusting to new circumstances." The phrase "new circumstances" landed like a slap. Juliette felt her face burn with embarrassment and anger. Her mother had managed to reference Sebastian's abandonment without saying his name, to question her judgment and her finances, all while maintaining perfect politeness. "Actually," Isaiah said quietly, "I think Juliette's generosity last night was inspiring. Too many people with resources forget their responsibility to give back." His words were mild, but there was steel underneath them. A defense of her that she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she deserved. Evelyn's eyes sharpened as they focused on him. "Oh, and what's your philosophy on charitable giving, Mr. Cole?" "That those who have much should share with those who have little. Seems pretty straightforward to me." How refreshingly simple. Her tone could have cut glass. "Though I find that reality is often more complex than philosophy suggests." "Sometimes," Isaiah agreed, "but sometimes the complex explanations are just ways of avoiding simple truths." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken tension. Juliette realized that she was holding her breath, waiting to see who would blink first. It was Mrs. Whitmore who broke the moment, launching into a detailed description of the museum's new exhibition. But the damage was done. Evelyn and Isaiah had taken each other's measure, and neither had backed down. After brunch, they said their goodbyes. Evelyn pulled Juliette aside. "He's very articulate," she said, making the words sound like an accusation. "Yes, he is. And handsome, I suppose." In his way, Juliette said nothing, recognizing the trap. "Darling," Evelyn continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't you think you're being a bit dramatic? This whole thing feels rather like a performance." The words hit closer to home than her mother could have known. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you do." Evelyn's smile was cold as winter. "My daughter, I know when you're acting." Outside the club, Isaiah was quiet as they walked toward the car. Finally, he spoke. "Well, that was fun. I'm sorry. She can be difficult." "Difficult." He laughed. "But there was no humor in it. Is that what we're calling it? You mean? He stopped walking and turned to face her. You know exactly what I mean. The way she looked at me, the questions she asked, the way she made sure everyone at that table knew I didn't belong there. She was just being protective of what? Your reputation, your social standing. His voice was rising slightly. Or just protecting you from the embarrassment of being seen with someone like me. That's not... She started to deny it, then stopped. Because wasn't that exactly what this was about? Her reputation, her standing, her image. You used me, he said quietly, to make a point to your mother. To show her that you didn't need her approval or Sebastian's love or anyone's acceptance. You used me like a weapon. The accusation hung between them like a blade. And the worst part was, she knew he was right. I didn't mean to, she whispered. Didn't you? She looked up at him. This man she barely knew, but who seemed to see her more clearly than people who had known her for years. His dark eyes held disappointment, and somehow that was worse than anger would have been. I'm sorry, she said. So am I, he replied. They rode back to her brownstone in silence. The space between them on the leather seat feeling like an ocean. When they arrived, she turned to him with desperate words forming on her lips. Apologies, explanations, promises. To do better. But Isaiah was already getting out of the car. I'll see you tonight, he said through the open door. 7 o'clock for dinner. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the weight of her own shame and the echo of her mother's knowing smile. By evening, Juliette's brownstone felt like a mausoleum. She had spent the afternoon pacing from room to room, replaying the brunch conversation in her mind, dissecting every word, every glance, every moment of tension. The silence pressed against her eardrums until she thought she might scream, just to hear something other than her own breathing. When Isaiah arrived at 7, she was ready at least outwardly. Her hair was perfect, her makeup flawless, her dress a study in understated elegance. But her hands shook slightly as she opened the door, and she saw him notice. Are you all right? He asked, and the genuine concern in his voice almost undid her. Fine, just tired. She stepped aside to let him in, noting that he had changed clothes. Instead of another formal outfit, he wore dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that hugged his frame in a way that made her suddenly aware of him as a man rather than just an actor playing a role. We have about an hour before we need to leave for Senator Morrison's. Good. We should talk. The words sent a chill through her. She led him to the living room, but this time, instead of sitting across from each other like adversaries, he chose the spot next to her on the sofa, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something warm and woody that was nothing like Sebastian's expensive French fragrance. About this afternoon, she began, but he held up a hand. Let me go first, he said. I owe you an apology. She blinked in surprise. You owe me an apology. I was harsh. After brunch, I said things that... He paused, running a hand over his hair. Look, I know what your mother was doing. I've seen it before. The polite interrogation, the subtle put-downs, the way she made sure everyone knew I was the help, not the guest. Isaiah, but that's not your fault. You didn't make her that way, and you can't control how she treats people. I was angry, and I took it out on you, and that wasn't fair. His words were so unexpected that she felt tears prick behind her eyes. When was the last time someone had apologized to her? Really apologized? Not the strategic non-apologies that passed for contrition in her world. You weren't wrong, though, she said quietly. About me using you. About the performance. I was trying to prove something to her, and I didn't think about how that would feel for you. What were you trying to prove? She looked down at her hands. Those perfectly manicured fingers that had never done a day's real work. That I don't need her approval. That I can make my own choices, live my own life, by hiring a black man to play your boyfriend. The bluntness of it made her flinch. It wasn't about race, wasn't it? Even a little bit. She wanted to deny it, to insist that his race hadn't factored into her decision at all. But sitting there in the warm lamplight of her living room, with his dark eyes watching her face, she found she couldn't lie to him, or to herself. Maybe, she whispered, maybe I knew it would shock her. Maybe I wanted to shock her. And what did you think that would accomplish? I don't know. Something? Anything. Her voice was getting smaller, more fragile. Do you know what it's like to spend your entire life trying to earn love from someone who's incapable of giving it? To perform and perfect and polish yourself until you disappear and still never be enough. Isaiah was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me about Sebastian." The change of subject caught her off guard. What about him? What was he like? Really like? Not the public version? She thought about it, trying to remember Sebastian as he actually was rather than as she had wanted him to be. Charming, intelligent. He knew exactly what to say in any situation, exactly how to make people feel important. Sounds like he was performing too. He was, we both were. The admission came out like a confession. Our entire relationship was a performance. We looked perfect together, said the right things, attended the right events. But we never, we never really saw each other. And you want to be seen. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. I want to be known, really known. Not the image, not the reputation, not the trust fund, or the connections, or the perfect manners. Just me. Who is that? The real you. The question hit her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, because she realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that she didn't know. I'm not sure I remember, she said. Finally, Isaiah stood up suddenly, walking to the grand piano that dominated one corner of the room. His fingers traced the closed lid, and she wondered if he played. Can I tell you something? He said, without turning around. Of course. I became an actor because I wanted to disappear. Growing up where I did, looking like I do, I learned early that being noticed wasn't always safe. Acting gave me permission to be someone else. Someone who didn't have to carry all the weight of being black in America. He turned back to face her, leaning against the piano. But somewhere along the way, I realized that all those other characters I played, they were just pieces of me. The angry young man, the wise mentor, the tragic hero, they were all true. Acting didn't let me disappear. It let me discover who I really was. What does that have to do with me? Maybe you've been performing for so long because you're afraid of who you really are. But what if she's not as terrible as you think? What if the real Juliette is actually worth knowing? The words hung in the air between them, and she felt something crack open in her chest. Not breaking exactly, but opening. Like a door that had been locked for so long she had forgotten there was a room behind it. I used to write, she said suddenly. What? When I was younger, before I got involved in politics, before I met Sebastian, I wrote poetry. Terrible, pretentious poetry about love and loss and the meaning of existence. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. That doesn't sound terrible. It was, but it was mine. It was the only thing I did that wasn't about pleasing someone else or meeting someone else's expectations. What happened to it? I grew up, got practical. Learn that poetry doesn't pay the bills or win political campaigns or impress mothers. Do you miss it? The question was so simple, but it opened something inside her that she had kept carefully locked away. Every day, she whispered. Isaiah came back to the sofa, sitting closer this time. Close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. So right again, he said. I can't. I wouldn't know how anymore. Sure you would. It's like riding a bike or swimming. The body remembers even when the mind forgets. She looked at him and saw something she hadn't expected. Not pity or judgment or the careful politeness she was used to, but genuine interest. As if the woman who wrote terrible poetry was someone he might actually want to know. What about you? She asked. What did you want to be before you became an actor? A teacher, like my mother. I wanted to work with kids. Help them see that there were possibilities beyond what their neighborhoods offered them. What stopped you? Money? Student loans. The reality that substitute teaching barely pays enough to survive on. He shrugged. Acting pays better. Not much better, but enough. Do you miss it? Teaching, sometimes. Especially when I'm waiting tables and pretending to care whether someone wants their steak medium rare or medium well. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Juliette realized this was the first real conversation she had had in months. Maybe years. Not networking, or strategizing, or performing, just talking. We should go, she said finally, glancing at the clock on the mantel. Right. Senator Morrison waits for no one. But neither of them moved. Instead, Isaiah reached out and touched her hand, the first genuine touch between them. Not for show or performance, but just because. For what it's worth, he said, I think the real Juliette might be worth getting to know. Senator Morrison's Georgetown mansion was the kind of house that whispered power rather than shouting it. Federal-style brick, perfectly manicured gardens, windows that glowed with warm light against the December evening. Cars lined the circular driveway, Mercedes, BMWs, the occasional Tesla that announced its owner's environmental consciousness as clearly as their wealth. Juliette felt different walking up the limestone steps with Isaiah beside her, not because anything fundamental had changed, but because their conversation had shifted something between them. The armor of performance felt less necessary, less automatic. You look beautiful, Isaiah said as they approached the front door, and something in his tone made her look at him sharply. Thank you, she replied, but the words felt strange in her mouth. Not because she didn't hear compliments, she heard them constantly, meaningless social lubricants that rolled off her like water. But because when Isaiah said it, she almost believed he meant it. The door opened before they could ring the bell, revealing Senator Morrison himself, silver-haired man in his 60s, whose smile was as practiced as his handshake was firm. Juliette, my dear, he boomed, kissing her cheek with the familiarity of someone who had known her since she was a child. You look radiant, as always. Senator Morrison, thank you for having us. I'd like you to meet Isaiah Cole. The senator's handshake was appraising the grip of a man who sized up everyone he met as either useful or irrelevant. Isaiah, welcome. Any friend of Juliette's is a friend of ours. Inside, the house was exactly what Juliette had expected: tasteful antiques, original artwork, the kind of quiet luxury that came from generations of accumulated power. The other guests moved through the rooms like players in a familiar drama, their conversations a mix of politics, business, and social gossip. But tonight, Juliette found herself watching them differently. Maybe it was her conversation with Isaiah, or maybe it was simply exhaustion with her own performance. But she saw the calculation behind every smile, the agenda behind every laugh. Darling. Patricia Morrison swept over to them, a vision in burgundy silk. How lovely to see you. And you must be the mysterious Isaiah we've been hearing about. Mysterious? Isaiah's eyebrow quirked upward. Oh, you know how people talk? Patricia waved her hand dismissively. New romance, handsome stranger, all very exciting. Juliette felt her stomach tighten. She had hoped their appearance at the auction would satisfy people's curiosity, but clearly it had only whetted their appetite for gossip. We're keeping things private, she said carefully. Of course, of course, of course. But you make such a striking couple. The word striking hung in the air with all its loaded implications. Juliette glanced at Isaiah, but his expression remained perfectly neutral. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, with its crystal chandelier and portraits of long-dead politicians. Juliette found herself seated between a Supreme Court justice and a media mogul, with Isaiah across from her next to a pharmaceutical heiress and a tech entrepreneur. The conversation flowed like expensive wine, smooth, intoxicating, and ultimately empty. They discussed the latest political scandals, the stock market, the upcoming primary elections. Coy Isaiah contributed thoughtfully when asked direct questions, but mostly listened. And Juliette found herself watching him navigate the social currents with the same skill he had shown at brunch. So Isaiah, the pharmaceutical heiress, said during the fish course. Juliette mentioned, "You're in theater. Are you working on anything interesting?" "We're in rehearsals for King Lear," he replied, "playing Edmund." "Ah, the bastard son," the justice said with a chuckle. "Appropriate casting." The comment landed like a stone in still water. Conversations paused. Silverware clinked against china, and Juliette felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sorry," Isaiah's voice was perfectly calm. "Oh, you know Shakespeare," the justice continued, apparently oblivious to the offense he had caused. Always so clever with his character assignments. The bastard son who schemes against legitimate authority. "Actually," Isaiah said, his tone still controlled, "I think Shakespeare was more interested in exposing the arbitrary nature of legitimacy. Edmund's crime isn't his birth. His history is willingness to accept a system that devalues him because of it. The justice's smile faltered slightly. Well, yes, of course. Literary interpretation and all that. Indeed, Isaiah agreed. But Juliette could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he was holding himself. The conversation moved on, but the damage was done. Juliette could see the looks being exchanged across the table, the raised eyebrows and knowing glances. She wanted to say something to defend Isaiah, but the words stuck in her throat. After dinner, they moved to the library for brandy and cigars. Juliette excused herself to the powder room, needing a moment to breathe, to think, to process what had just happened. But when she emerged, she found Patricia Morrison waiting for her in the hallway. "My dear," Patricia said, her voice low and confidential. "I hope you know what you're doing. I'm sorry. With your young man, he's very intense. Very political. He's an actor, Patricia. He was discussing Shakespeare." Of course he was. Patricia's smile was sharp as a blade. "But you know how people are. They see what they want to see, hear what they expect to hear. And right now, with everything that's happened with Sebastian, What about Sebastian? Well, it just looks like you're making a statement, doesn't it? Dating someone so, different." After Sebastian's very public betrayal, words hit Juliette like physical blows. "It's not a statement. It's a relationship, is it?" Patricia's eyes were shrewd, calculating. "Because it rather looks like revenge. And while I understand the impulse, dear, you might want to consider the long-term implications for your career." Before Juliette could respond, Patricia had glided away, leaving her standing alone in the hallway with the echo of those words ringing in her ears. She found Isaiah on the terrace. Despite the cold evening air, he was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking out over the manicured gardens. "Are you all right?" she asked, joining him at the stone railing. "I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself apart from the warmth and light of the house behind them. The justice was out of line, she said. Was he just saying what everyone else was thinking? "Isaiah, do you know what I realized in there?" He turned to face her, and in the moonlight, his expression was unreadable. "I realized that no matter how well I speak, how much I know about Shakespeare or politics or wine, I'm always going to be the bastard son to them. The one who doesn't belong, who's only there because you brought me. That's not true, isn't it?" His voice was quiet, but there was pain underneath it. "Tell me something, Juliette. I was a white man's same background, same education, same job. Would your mother have asked where I was from? Would the justice have made that comment about appropriate casting?" She wanted to say yes, to insist that race had nothing to do with it. But standing there in the cold night air, with the sounds of privilege and power floating through the windows behind them, she couldn't bring herself to lie. "I don't know," she whispered. "At least you're honest." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of truth settling between them like snow. "I want to go home," she said finally. "We haven't been here 2 hours. I don't care. I want to leave. Please." Isaiah studied her face in the moonlight, and whatever he saw there made him nod. "All right. Let's go home." The word home hung in the air between them, and Juliette realized that for the first time in months, she actually meant it. Not her mother's house, not Sebastian's apartment, not the various venues where she performed her life for others, but her brownstone, with its silence and shadows and the possibility of being real. They made their excuses to their hosts and escaped into the night. In the car, Isaiah was quiet, staring out the window at the passing city lights. "I'm sorry," Juliette said finally. "For what?" "For all of it. For the way they looked at you, the things they said, for bringing you into this world where you have to defend your right to exist." "I've been defending my right to exist my whole life," he said softly. "That's not new. But it shouldn't be necessary. Not with me." He turned to look at her then, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart skip. "No," he said. "Shouldn't be." When they reached her brownstone, she expected him to leave, to walk away into the night and back to his own life. Instead, he followed her up the steps and waited while she unlocked the door. "Would you like to come in?" she asked. "For coffee? Or just to talk?" "Yes," he said. "I'd like that very much." Inside, they sat on her sofa again, but this time the space between them felt different, charged with possibility and weighted with truth. "Isaiah," she said, "I need to tell you something. About why I really hired you. About what this is really about. I'm listening." She took a deep breath, preparing to tell him the truth she had barely admitted to herself. That this had never been about Sebastian or her reputation or her mother's approval. That from the moment he had walked into her house, she had been performing for an audience of one him. That somewhere in the space between pretending and being real, she had started to care what he thought of her. But before she could speak, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was soft, tentative, nothing like the performative touches they had shared in public. This was real, honest. The kind of kiss that asked a question rather than making a statement. When they broke apart, she was breathless. "That wasn't part of the deal," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't. So why did you do it?" "Because," he said, his dark eyes holding hers. "I'm tired of pretending I don't want to." The fundraiser sparkled with artificial warmth, crystal glasses catching the light of chandeliers that cost more than most people's cars. Juliette moved through the crowd with Isaiah beside her, their practiced choreography of coupledom now second nature. She touched his arm at precise intervals, laughed at his observations about the overpriced art on the walls, let her fingers brush his when reaching for champagne. The performance had become too easy, too comfortable. That should have been her first warning. Sebastian appeared like a shadow from her past, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. He wore his politician's sun charm, like expensive Kolonov, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. The crowd parted around him naturally, drawn to power the way moths seek flame. "Juliette," he said, her name rolling off his tongue with practiced familiarity. "How refreshing to see you've diversified your interests." The word hung in the air like smoke. Isaiah's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders squaring in a way that spoke of years navigating such moments. Juliette felt the familiar flush of rage creeping up her neck, the same fury that had consumed her when she'd first seen those photos of Sebastian with his new fiancée. "Sebastian," she replied, her voice steady as morning frost. "Still compensating for your lack of substance with other people's money, I see." The crowd around them had gone quiet, sensing blood in the water. These people lived for moments, like this public humiliation disguised as polite conversation. Sebastian's eyes flicked to Isaiah, assessment and dismissal happening in the same breath. "Your new activist rebound is certainly interesting," Sebastian continued, his tone suggesting Isaiah was an exotic pet rather than a person. "Tell me, does he actually understand the causes you're funding tonight? Or is this more about image rehabilitation?" The words struck like lightning. Every assumption, every microaggression, every careful slight wrapped in silk and delivered with surgical precision. Juliette felt something inside her chest crack wide open. "At least he's real," she snapped, her voice carrying further than intended. "At least when he touches me, it's not because his campaign manager told him it would pull well with suburban wives." The silence that followed was deafening. Isaiah had gone perfectly still beside her, his face carefully blank in the way she'd learned meant he was protecting himself from whatever came next. Sebastian's smile widened, sensing victory. "How wonderfully authentic," Sebastian purred. "Though I do hope you're compensating him fairly for his ... emotional labor. After all, we both know how expensive good acting can be." The crack in Juliette's chest became a chasm. Years of swallowed rage, of performed perfection, of being reduced to her utility rather than her humanity, came pouring out. "You want to know about acting," she said, her voice cutting through the crystal and silk like a blade. "I hired him. I paid Isaiah to pretend to love me because I couldn't bear the thought of you knowing how completely you destroyed me. Because I was so desperate not to appear broken that I bought myself a boyfriend like a piece of jewelry." The crowd around them had expanded, drawn by the spectacle. Phones appeared, recording the socialite breakdown that would be dissected in gossip columns for weeks. Juliette could see the headlines already. "Desperate heiress pays for love." Every smile, every touch, every tender moment you've all witnessed over these past weeks, was purchased. She continued, her voice gaining strength even as tears began to fall. Because apparently I'm so fundamentally unlovable that even fake affection has to be negotiated with a contract. Isaiah stepped away from her then, his movement small but decisive. Not cruel, just ... separate, creating distance from the wreckage she was creating with her words. His face remained composed, professional even, but she caught something in his eyes that looked like disappointment. "Juliette," he said quietly, his voice pitched only for her despite the audience surrounding them. Stop. But she couldn't stop. The performance had finally become real, and she was drowning in the authenticity she'd claimed to want. "No, you stop," she said, turning to face him fully. "Stop pretending this meant something. Stop looking at me like I'm more than a paycheck. Stop making me believe that someone could actually..." She broke off, the words dying in her throat. Isaiah nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both understanding and farewell. He adjusted his jacket with the same careful dignity he'd maintained throughout their arrangement, looked once more at the crowd of faces, staring at them like they were animals in a zoo. "Good luck, Juliette," he said simply, and walked away. The crowd watched him go with the fascination reserved for particularly dramatic theater. Some were already typing on their phones, spreading the news across social networks with gleeful efficiency. Others simply stared at Juliette, waiting to see what other secrets she might spill in her spectacular unraveling. Sebastian clapped slowly, mockingly. "Well done," he said. "I always knew you had a flair for the dramatic, though I do think you've outdone yourself this time." Juliette looked around at the faces surrounding her, people she'd known for years, had considered friends, had raised money alongside. Now they watched her with the hungry attention of vultures circling carrion. She realized with crystalline clarity that she had never been more than entertainment to them, a cautionary tale in designer clothing. She walked toward the exit without another word, leaving behind the whispers and the cameras and the life she'd spent 36 years carefully constructing. The performance was finally over. The brownstone felt different when Juliette returned that night. Not bigger or smaller, but somehow more honest. The silence that had once felt oppressive now seemed to hold space for truth. She kicked off her heels in the entryway, leaving them where they fell, like shed skin from a creature learning to molt. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Reporters, friends, family members who'd seen the videos already circulating online. She turned it off without reading the messages. Whatever they had to say could wait indefinitely. The living room stretched before her, every piece of furniture positioned with magazine-worthy precision. The throw pillows that had never been thrown, the coffee table books that had never been. Read the flowers that were replaced weekly, whether they'd wilted or not. It was a stage set for a life she'd never actually lived. Margot had left dinner wrapped in the refrigerator, along with a note written in her careful cursive. "Mia, whatever happened tonight, it will pass. Call if you need anything. M." The kindness of it made Juliette's chest tight with unexpected emotion. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the pristine white sofa, not caring if she stained the expensive fabric. The house settled around her with small creaks and sighs, sounds she'd never noticed when it was filled with the performance of living. "What have I done?" she whispered to the empty room. The question echoed back, unanswered. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the exact moment when everything had shifted, when the careful boundaries of their arrangement had begun to blur. Had it been when Isaiah recited that monologue, his voice carrying depths she hadn't expected? When he'd noticed she wasn't eating at the charity lunch and quietly ordered her something plain? When he'd fixed her necklace without being asked, his fingers gentle at the nape of her neck? Or had it been earlier, in that first moment when he'd looked at her across the threshold of her door and seen something she'd tried so hard to hide? The desperation, the loneliness, the bone-deep exhaustion of being Juliette Vance. She remembered his words from that night: "You don't want me. You want not to be alone." The accuracy of it had felt like surgery without anesthesia, truth cutting through tissue to reach infection. The wine tasted bitter on her tongue. She set the glass aside and pulled her legs up onto the sofa, wrapping her arms around her knees like a child seeking comfort. When had she last sat like this? When had she last allowed herself to take up space without consideration for how she looked, how she appeared, what message her posture might send? Her reflection in the dark window showed a stranger hair mussed, makeup smeared, designer dress wrinkled from sitting improperly. She looked human, flawed, real. It should have been horrifying, but instead, she felt something that might have been relief. "I wasn't acting," she said aloud, testing the words Isaiah had used. "I just wanted someone to mean it." But that wasn't entirely true, was it? She'd wanted him to mean it without meaning it herself. She'd wanted the comfort of being loved without the vulnerability of loving in return. She'd wanted to consume his warmth without offering any of her own. The realization sat heavy in her stomach. She'd done exactly what Sebastian had done to her, used another person as a prop in the performance of her own life. The difference was that Isaiah had been honest about the arrangement from the beginning. She was the one who'd let the lines blur, who'd started believing her own fiction. Her mother would call soon, voice sharp with disappointment and social anxiety. Her father would send a terse email about family reputation and public responsibility. The foundation board would meet to discuss her future with the organization. Friends would choose sides, or, more likely, choose distance. But for the first time in months, Juliette found she didn't care about any of it. The performance was over, and while the reviews were certain to be brutal, at least she was finally off the stage. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Isaiah's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment before she set the device aside. What could she possibly say? "Thank you for the service. Sorry I imploded our arrangement in front of a room full of gossips. Forgive me for not knowing the difference between loneliness and love." The house continued its quiet settling around her. Somewhere in the walls, the heating system hummed to life. Outside, traffic moved through the city like blood through arteries. Life continuing, indifferent to her small tragedy. She would sit here tonight in the ruins of her reputation and figure out who Juliette Vance actually was when no one was watching. It felt terrifying and necessary in equal measure. The empty house held her gently in its silence. 3 days passed before Isaiah appeared at her door again. Juliette had spent those days in a strange kind of hibernation, moving through her brownstone, like a ghost haunting her own life. She'd ignored phone calls, deleted social media apps, and lived on whatever Margot had stocked in the refrigerator, before discreetly making herself scarce. When the doorbell rang that Thursday evening, she almost didn't answer. The media attention had been relentless. Photographers camped outside, reporters calling at all hours, think pieces about wealth and performative relationships appearing faster than she could avoid reading them. But something about the pattern of the ring, patient and deliberate, made her look through the peephole. Isaiah stood on her steps wearing the same jacket he'd worn to their first gallery event, his hands tucked deep in his pockets against the February cold. He wasn't looking at the door, but at something beyond it, his profile sharp against the amber streetlight. There was no expectation in his posture, no demand for entry. He looked like a man who'd come to deliver a message and would wait as long as necessary to deliver it. She opened the door without speaking. They regarded each other across the threshold, the same space where this had all begun. Though it felt like years rather than weeks since that first negotiation. "I'm not here to continue anything," he said, without preamble. "I came to finish it properly." She stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he moved through her space, no longer careful to avoid disruption, no longer mindful of the expensive surfaces and delicate arrangements. He'd shed the protective caution he'd worn like armor. During their performances, "You want coffee, tea?" she asked, falling back on hostess rituals because she didn't know how else to be with him now that the script was gone. "I want you to listen," he said, settling into the armchair where he'd never sat during their arrangement. Always the sofa then, always positioned so she could touch his arm or lean against his shoulder when the situation required it. "Really, listen, not just wait for your turn to perform." She curled into the opposite corner of the sofa, pulling a throw blanket around herself like armor. Outside, camera flashes lit up the windows sporadically. The photographers were persistent, if nothing else. "I've been thinking about what you said at that fundraiser," Isaiah began, his voice carrying the measured cadence she recognized from his theater work. "About being unlovable, about having to purchase affection, And I realized something that I should have told you weeks ago. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, making direct eye contact in a way that felt both intimate and uncomfortable. Weren't paying me to love you, Juliette. You were paying me to witness you. To see you in a way that felt safe because it was temporary and transactional. But real love can't be purchased because it's not a service. It's not something one person does for another. The words hit her like small stones, each one precise and unavoidable. I played the part you asked me to play, he continued. Attentive boyfriend, supportive partner, arm candy with enough substance to make you feel intellectually superior to Sebastian. But every time I tried to see the actual woman underneath all that performance, you'd redirect me back to the script. That's not, she started, but he raised a hand gently. Let me finish, please. His voice held no anger, just a tired kind of patience. You asked me to act like I loved you, but you never once asked what that might actually look like, what questions I might ask, what vulnerabilities I might want to share, what fears or dreams or stupid daily habits make up the person behind the role. She pulled the blanket tighter, recognizing the truth in his words like a physical ache. You wanted to be loved without being known, Isaiah said, and I wanted to be paid without being seen. We were both hiding, just in different ways. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of recognition. Outside, she heard one of the photographers calling to another, coordinating their harassment with professional efficiency. So, what now? She asked finally, her voice smaller than she'd intended. Now you stop, he said simply. Stop performing, stop purchasing, stop trying to control the narrative of your own life like it's a PR campaign. Start with the silence. Learn to sit with who you are when no one's watching, when there's no audience to please or impression to manage. I don't know how to do that. Yes, you do. You've been doing it these past 3 days. I can see it in how you're sitting, how you're breathing. You look, he paused, searching for the right words. You look like a person instead of a press release, she laughed, surprising herself with the sound. It came out rusty, unpracticed, but genuine. The funny thing is, Isaiah continued, if you'd asked me on that first day to just sit with you in your loneliness, to be present without pretense, I probably would have said yes. No contract, no performance, no payment required. Just 2 people, sharing space honestly. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Because loneliness recognizes loneliness, he said. And because the person I glimpsed underneath all that careful construction seemed worth knowing. He stood then, adjusting that same jacket with familiar precision. But this time, the gesture felt like completion rather than preparation for performance. Take care of yourself, Juliette. The real version, not the one you think the world needs to see. She watched him move toward the door, noting how his presence had somehow made the enormous room feel properly proportioned for the first time since she'd bought the place. Isaiah, she called as he reached for the door handle. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. He turned back once, offering a smile that was entirely his own. No performance, no transaction, just simple human kindness. That's what people do, he said, when they mean it. The decision came to her on a Tuesday morning while staring at her phone screen, scrolling through the carefully curated grid of her Instagram profile. Each image was a masterpiece of calculated spontaneity, candid shots that had taken dozens of attempts. Casual moments staged with military precision. Smiles practiced in mirrors until they looked effortless. She deleted the entire account without ceremony. Facebook followed, then Twitter, then LinkedIn, each platform disappearing with a few taps of her finger. Years of digital performance erased in minutes, leaving behind only the strange lightness of being unobserved. Her publicist would panic when she discovered the social media silence. But Juliette found she could barely summon concern for that future conversation. The brownstone felt different in the absence of documentation. She caught herself reaching for her phone to photograph her coffee cup before remembering there was nowhere to post it. No audience to charm with her aesthetic choices. The coffee was just coffee, bitter, too hot, imperfect. She drank it anyway. Margot returned that afternoon with groceries and questions held carefully behind her warm brown eyes. They moved around each other in the kitchen with familiar choreography, Margot putting away supplies while Juliette made space at the counter. "The reporters are still outside," Margot observed, folding paper bags with characteristic efficiency. "Let them wait," Juliette replied, surprised by her own indifference. "They'll get bored eventually." "Your mother called the house phone." "I'm sure she did." Margot paused in her organizing, studying Juliette's face with the keen attention of someone who'd spent years reading emotional weather patterns. "You seem different, Mia. Quieter, but not sad quiet. Something else." Juliette considered this assessment while arranging apples in the fruit bowl, not for appearance, but because the task felt grounding. "I feel like I'm learning how to breathe properly for the first time." "That's good," Margot said simply. "Breathing is important." That evening, while researching community theater schedules with no particular plan in mind, Juliette found Isaiah's name listed in the cast of an upcoming production, Fences, at a small theater in Harlem, opening in 2 weeks. His bio was brief, professional, mentioning his background in education alongside his acting credits. Reading it, she realized how little she'd actually known about his life beyond their arrangement. She bought a ticket for the following Saturday's performance. Not to reconnect, not to apologize again, not to insert herself back into his narrative. Simply to witness his work without agenda. To see him in the space where he belonged rather than the one where she'd borrowed him. The theater was smaller than she'd expected. Tucked between a bookstore and a cafe on a street that hummed with genuine community rather than performed culture. The audience was diverse in ways her usual venues never managed. Families and couples and solitary theater lovers settling into mismatched chairs with the comfortable familiarity of regulars. Juliette chose a seat in the back corner, wearing jeans and a sweater she'd owned for years but never worn outside the house. No makeup beyond mascara. Hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked like any other patron, anonymous in her ordinariness. The lights dimmed, and Isaiah appeared on stage as Troy Maxon, commanding the space with a presence that seemed to expand beyond the small theater's boundaries. This was different from the monologue she'd heard in her living room, fuller, more complex, inhabited rather than performed. He moved through the role with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. She watched him work, noting the way he listened to his scene partners, how he used silence as effectively as words, the physical precision that spoke of careful preparation and natural instinct working in harmony. This was Isaiah without compromise, without the careful modulation he'd employed in her world of crystal and careful conversation. During intermission, she considered leaving. Her presence felt like intrusion, a remnant of their complicated past. That might disturb his present, but something about the authenticity of what she'd witnessed held her in place. This wasn't about her at all. It was about honoring his craft, his choice to transform personal experience into art. The second act was even more powerful. Isaiah carrying the weight of Troy's disappointments and dreams with devastating honesty. When the final lights came up, the audience rose in genuine appreciation, not the polite applause of obligation, but the enthusiastic response of people who'd been moved. Juliette remained seated as the theater emptied around her, watching the cast take their bows, noting how Isaiah's smile reached his eyes in a way she'd rarely seen during their weeks together. This was joy without performance. Satisfaction earned through honest work. She left during the cast's final bow, slipping out the back exit into the cool night air. The street was busy with post-theater energy, people discussing the show, making dinner plans, living their unobserved lives with casual authenticity. Walking back to the subway, Juliette felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the simple pleasure of having attended an event without being the event, of witnessing art without needing to be seen witnessing it, of existing in public space without agenda or angle. Her phone remained silent in her pocket. No photos taken, no posts crafted. No digital proof of her presence required. The experience belonged entirely to her, unshared and uncommercialized. On the train home, she closed her eyes and held the memory of Isaiah's performance. His voice carrying Troy's final monologue about the weight of responsibility and the cost of protection. She thought about the person she'd been when they'd first met, desperate to be seen, but terrified of being known, and the person she was becoming, learning to exist without audience. to find worth without witness. The train carried her back to her empty brownstone, where she would sit with the silence and continue learning how to be alone without being lonely. It felt like the beginning of something true. CTA, ever felt like your life was a script someone else wrote? Let us know if you relate to Juliette's story. The envelope arrived on expensive letterhead, hand-delivered by courier, while Juliette was attempting to make pancakes from a box mix, a skill that had somehow never been included in her extensive education. Margot had taken the week off to visit her sister in Philadelphia, leaving Juliette alone with domestic mysteries like proper syrup to pancake ratios and the optimal heat setting for eggs that didn't emerge rubber like from the pan. She recognized her mother's handwriting immediately. Those perfectly formed letters taught by decades of etiquette instructors and reinforced by social necessity. The envelope felt heavier than its contents could possibly warrant, weighted with the kind of significance her mother attached to formal communications. Inside, single sheet of cream-colored paper bore 3 lines in Evelyn Vance's precise script. Juliette, you have embarrassed this family beyond repair. Your father's memory deserves better than this spectacle. Do not contact me until you've found some dignity. No signature, no closing sentiment, just the brutal efficiency of a woman severing connections. With surgical precision, Juliette read it twice, waiting for the familiar stab of shame and desperate need for approval that usually accompanied her mother's disapproval. Instead, she felt something closer to relief. She set the letter aside and returned to her pancakes, which had developed an unfortunate resemblance to rubber discs despite her careful attention to the instructions. The kitchen, once Margot's exclusive domain, has become her laboratory for discovering the basic life skills that wealth and privilege had rendered unnecessary. To her phone rang, her mother's number appearing on the screen with the persistence of someone accustomed to immediate response. Juliette watched it ring through to voicemail, then ring again, then fall silent. The absence of urgency felt like a small revolution. The house phone followed, its shrill tone echoing through rooms that had been designed for entertaining rather than living. Juliette unplugged it from the wall and carried the silent device to the closet, where it could join the growing collection of connections she was choosing to sever. That afternoon, she walked through the brownstone with new eyes, cataloging the artifacts of a life lived for exhibition rather than experience. Her father's study remained exactly as he'd left it 8 years ago, every book and paper positioned as carefully as museum displays. Her mother visited annually to ensure nothing had been disturbed, treating the space like a shrine to respectability, rather than a room where a person had once worked and dreamed and struggled with ordinary human concerns. In the master bedroom, her dresser top displayed photographs in silver frames, family portraits, from charity galas, society weddings, foundation events. Every image captured public moments, performances of happiness and success. She couldn't find a single photograph of private joy, unguarded laughter, or the casual intimacy that marked authentic relationships. She began removing them methodically, wrapping each frame in tissue paper before placing it in boxes that would go to storage. Not destroyed, she wasn't angry enough for destruction, but removed from the daily performance of memory. The jewelry box yielded more complex decisions. Pieces from her father, gifts that carried genuine affection beneath their monetary value. Items from Sebastian, their history now tainted by his calculated cruelty. And the family heirlooms her mother had passed down like a relay race of feminine respectability. Pearls and diamonds that came with instructions about proper occasions and appropriate settings. She selected a single strand of pearls, the ones her grandmother had worn daily rather than reserving for special occasions. These felt different from the others, worn smooth by years of actual use rather than careful preservation. She fastened them around her neck and examined her reflection in the mirror, without makeup, dressed in clothes chosen for comfort rather than impression. Wearing pearls that had been loved rather than merely valued, she looked like herself, not the curated version that had appeared in society pages, but the person who existed in private moments, unobserved and unperformed. The remaining jewelry went into a velvet-lined box with a note written in her own careful script. Mother, I'm returning what was never truly mine. Perhaps they'll serve you better than they've served me. She addressed the package to her mother's apartment on the Upper East Side. That museum of propriety where conversations were conducted in whispers and emotions were expressed through gift selections and strategic silences. The courier would deliver it tomorrow, along with the quiet message that Juliette was choosing her own inheritance. As evening approached, she made herself a simple dinner: scrambled eggs that were only slightly overcooked toast that was merely burnt around the edges rather than charcoal. She ate at the kitchen counter rather than the formal dining room, reading a novel she'd bought impulsively rather than one from her father's carefully curated library. The silence of the house no longer felt oppressive. It had become spacious, full of possibility rather than emptiness. She was learning to inhabit it without needing to fill it with performance or approval, or the constant hum of other people's expectations. Her mother's words echoed briefly, "Find some dignity." But Juliette was beginning to understand that dignity couldn't be found in other people's definitions. It had to be constructed from the inside out, built on foundations of honesty rather than reputation. She was finally learning the difference. 6 weeks later, Juliette sat in the same back corner of the Harlem Theater, wearing a different sweater but the same comfortable anonymity. The spring production was Isaiah's one-man show, a piece he'd written and developed during the years when bigger dreams had seemed impossible. The program notes were sparse, offering no explanation for the title. I wasn't acting. The theater was fuller this time, word having spread about the previous production's power. She recognized some faces from the February show, the loyal audience that follows good work wherever it appears. She'd purchased her ticket under a different name, paid in cash, taken the subway instead of a car service. These small acts of invisibility had become second nature. Isaiah took the stage alone, no set pieces beyond a single chair and a microphone stand. He wore simple black clothing that seemed to absorb the stage lights rather than reflect them. For the first few moments, he simply stood there, letting the audience settle into silence. "My name is Isaiah Cole," he began, his voice carrying easily through the small space. "For the past 20 years, I've been an actor, which means I've spent 2 decades learning how to pretend to be other people. Tonight, I want to try something different." What followed was 90 minutes of devastating honesty. He spoke about childhood dreams deferred, about the weight of others' expectations, about the exhaustion that comes from constant performance. He talked about love and loneliness, about the difference between being seen and being witnessed, about the stories we tell ourselves to make disappointment bearable. Juliette recognized fragments of their conversations woven throughout, transformed from specific experience into universal truth. He spoke about a woman who had forgotten how to exist without audience, about the courage required to be ordinary, about the price of purchasing what should be freely given. "I met someone recently," he said, settling into the chair with the easy confidence of a natural storyteller, "who asked me to pretend to love her. At first, I thought she was the one who was acting. But I realized something during those weeks together." He paused, looking directly at a spot somewhere above the audience's heads, as if addressing someone just beyond their sight. "I wasn't acting when I fixed her necklace without being asked. I wasn't acting when I noticed she wasn't eating and ordered her something plain. I wasn't acting when I listened to her talk about her father's death and felt the weight of her grief as if it were my own." The theater had gone completely still. Even the usual theater rustlings, programs shifting, chairs creaking, throats clearing had ceased. "The acting came later," Isaiah continued, "when I pretended that caring about her was just part of the performance. When I acted like her pain didn't matter because she was paying me to witness it. When I convinced myself that emotional distance was professional integrity." Juliette felt tears sliding down her cheeks, silent and unstoppable. "So this is me, not acting," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "This is me admitting that sometimes we find connection in the strangest places, with the most unlikely people, under circumstances that make no sense at all. And that's okay. That's human." He stood, moved back to center stage, looked out at the audience with complete openness. "My name is Isaiah Cole. I'm 38 years old. I teach high school English on weekdays and tend bar on weekends. I write monologues and notebooks I buy at the corner store. I'm afraid of heights and spiders and the possibility that I'll never be brave enough to love someone completely. The final line came like an exhale. I wasn't acting. I just needed someone to mean it. The silence that followed felt sacred. Then applause began. Not the polite acknowledgement of obligation, but the sustained response of people who had been changed by what they'd witnessed. Juliette slipped out during the standing ovation, not to avoid connection, but to preserve it. Some experiences were too important to risk diluting with aftermath. She walked to the subway through streets alive with evening energy, carrying Isaiah's words like a gift at home. She sat in her kitchen and wrote him a letter not to send, but to complete the conversation he'd begun on stage. She thanked him for seeing her when she couldn't see herself, for teaching her the difference between performance and presence, for showing her that meaning couldn't be purchased but had to be earned through vulnerability. She sealed the letter in an envelope she would never mail, adding it to the growing collection of authentic moments she was creating for an audience of one. Outside, the city continued its restless symphony. Inside, Juliette finally understood the difference between being alone and being lonely. The performance was over. The silence that remained was full of possibility.